In this demo, we will be showcasing the differences between symbols and objects, and among symbols, what are the differences between movie clips, buttons, and graphics. So with that in mind, let me go ahead and get started. I'm going to create a new composition, and this composition will be the default settings for character animation, which is standard 640 by 480 pixels at 30 FPS. And I'm going to use Canvas as my template. I can also use my action script. As a matter of fact, let's go ahead and use action script so that we have the full range of tools. So let's go ahead and click create on this. And what I'm going to be doing now is I am going to be closing these windows. These are from coding, so we don't need those just yet. Make sure that I see my timeline. And the stage, as you know, is related to the timeline. Now, when you first create a project, you are at the top level, what we call scene 1. You can have as many scenes as you need, and you can keep on creating new scenes. If you have more than one scene, they would be all listed down here. Also, when you are at this level, everything that you create is related to this timeline. However, depending on what elements, what objects you're working with, you can create timelines that are separate from this timeline. And that's where the differences between objects, drawing objects, and symbols comes in. So if I go to my tools panel and I select an object, let's say, a tool like the rectangle tool, and say, let me switch the color of this so we can better see what I'm doing. So I'm going to click, select the dark blue, and I'm going to press shift on the keyboard and drag a rectangle so that I have a square. Now, as you know, by doing this, if I select it, notice that I get the little pattern inside it. That indicates to me that this is a shape. I can also go to the Object Properties window, and I can see that it is a shape. When it's created, nothing happens in the library. There is nothing in the library at this moment. So this resides on this timeline. That is what we call a shape. Now, you can also select the same tool. And going before you start working under the Tool Properties window, you can click on this icon here, which will switch your drawing to a different mode. So let me go ahead and draw this one. I'm going to draw another rectangle. Now, when I click on this one, you will notice that I do not get the same fill selection as this one. In this case, I have what is a blue outline around my object, and this is called a drawing object. And that was because when I was under the tool, I selected that swatch. When I was under the rectangle tool, I selected this swatch, which indicated I wanted to draw a rectangle object, a drawing object. The difference being that with this fill, I can go ahead and use my selection tool, go to the edge, and deform it by pulling on its edges if I want to. So this almost acts like a piece of Play-Doh. In this one, when I go to the edge, I cannot do the same thing. This moves the entire object. So to deform this drawing object, I would have to use my deformation tools, such as my free transform tool that allow me to resize. Or if I want to actually do something to it, I would have to break it apart. And to break it apart, I would have to select the object and go modify and then break apart. That's what I would need to do. So if we want to do that, it depends on what your original goal is for the object that you're working with. So in this case, this is a drawing object tool. This is a shape tool, two completely different types of tool. You also have the option of creating what we call primitive tools. So if I long press that particular button for that tool and I go to the rectangle primitive tool, this gives me another set of options when I'm creating my objects. You'll notice that this one has a different outline around it with the little dots. This primitive tool behaves almost like a rectangle tool would in Illustrator. So if you notice under the object properties for it, I have things that are very familiar from Illustrator, such as, having corner options and changing things like that automatically from here. So you have different types of sets of drawing objects within the environment. So you can basically start from either a shape, an object, a drawing object, or a primitive. Which one is better for what? Well, that all depends on your workflow. Shapes give you very organic shapes, very organic objects, and you can modify those through shape tweening. Eventually, in the next class, in the next week, we will be talking about shape tweening. But it will allow you to morph it will allow you to morph one object to another very organically by using shapes. When drawing with objects, you cannot morph. For object drawing, you would have to start thinking about motion tweening. And for that, you need to turn these objects into what we call symbols. Same thing with primitives. Now, the difference between these two, between a drawing object and a primitive, is the access to properties that you have depending on the object that you play with. So in this case, right now I have this primitive selected and I see my options here for it. If I go to my drawing object right here, I notice that I have other options that I can work with. So it all depends on what is your fastest workflow. Keep in mind that any of these things can be changed at any time into the other. So you can always convert one thing to another if you need to. By, for example, if I don't want this drawing object to be a drawing object and I want it to be a shape, I can always break it apart by going under Modify, Break Apart. And you'll notice that it ceases to be a drawing object and it turns into a shape. So I can always do that. Or I can always group it if I want to. And now it starts behaving almost like a drawing object, although it is a group now. So, and by the way, to group, you do Control-G just like you would in any other program. So you have these abilities to work with the different options as you progress through your workflows. Let me drag a selection across all of these things and delete them. So those were objects. Those were drawing objects. Now, let's talk about symbols. Symbols are a way of putting a wrapper around the objects that you draw or that you import and being able to control them within your timeline. So almost like setting them up for animation. So if I go, let me long press on the rectangle to keep using the same tool. I am going to create a rectangle on the stage and I am going to select it. Now you'll notice that it is right now a drawing object. Now, either whether I'm working with a drawing object, with a shape or a primitive, any of those three things can be turned into a symbol. And the way to turn an item into a symbol is by selecting it on the stage, and then going under Modify, Convert to Symbol, or F8. That's the shortcut. So if I select the object and I press the F8 key on the keyboard, a window opens up telling me you want to convert this to a symbol. Now what happens at this point is I am asked to give it a name, and I would use a name that represents the object that I'm working with. In this case, as a square, it is a square. So in your case, if you were trying to create an app, or if you're creating a prototype for a website, and this is button 1, or button for Facebook, or button for submit or something like that, then you would call it button, submit button, or Facebook button, whatever name makes sense to whatever that symbol will be doing. And then you have three options to choose from. The three options for symbols include movie clip, button, and graphic. A movie clip symbol, it's a symbol that has a timeline of its own. So if I create animation inside it, that animation will be respected on my main timeline, regardless if I have 1 or if I have 1,000,000 frames on this timeline. So if that animation will be self-contained, it will be embedded inside that movie clip, and it will play when you run the program. When you actually export this, that animation will play, whether you're working on HTML5 or ActionScript 3. A button, it's a special type of symbol that gives you 4 states. It gives you the neutral state, the hover over state, when you click on the state, and the area where you need to click. So we're going to be seeing that in just a second. And then a graphic, which is a type of symbol that is similar to a movie clip. It does contain a timeline of its own, but any animation inside it needs to be matched by frames on the main timeline if we want it to play. That is to say, I create an animation inside a graphic symbol. Let's say I choose graphic, and my animation is a square moving across the screen. Let's say that animation takes 10 frames. So my graphic has 10 frames inside it. But if my movie clip, the main scene, only has 1 frame, I will only be seeing the first frame of that graphic. My animation won't play back. Unlike movie clip, in which case, even if I have only 1 frame available here, because the animation is embedded inside the movie clip, it will play back. So movie clips will have timelines that play no matter what, unless you tell them no, not to play via code. But graphics will have timelines that won't play unless your frames from the main timeline match the frames inside that movie clip, inside that graphic. So keep that in mind. So let's choose first and foremost graphic. Let's see what a graphic does. So if I click on graphic and I click OK, there is my graphic, and gives me options for it. It allows me to do effects on it, create keyframes, and we will be seeing how to animate these things in the near future. Let's go ahead and create another shape. I'm going to go ahead and create a circle. I'm going to select it, and that circle will be, I'm going to press F8 with it selected. I'm going to press F8, and I'm going to call this one circle. And I am going to make this one a button. So if I click button, you'll notice that basically my properties change depending on what I'm working with. The properties are context sensitive. This is an instance of that square graphic on the stage. This is an instance of that circle symbol on the stage. You will also notice that if I go to my library, I now have the two items that I've just declared to be symbols. So every time you create a symbol, it is saved inside your library. If you're going to animate anything except for shapes, if you're going to animate anything through motion tweening or classic motion tweening, it needs to be a symbol. With shapes, it works slightly different. With shapes, you need to create shape tweening, and you do not need to convert the shape into a symbol to animate it. So shapes give you more organic animation. When you want to create something that looks almost natural, or like it's hand-drawn or something like that, you would be using shape tweening. For mechanical motion or something that is more controlled by the computer, you would be using the other two symbols, movie clips or graphics. So now, let's go back to the properties for this. And you'll notice that the properties change, including where to access alpha information and all that stuff, changing colors, tint, and all that. You also have the ability to change the sizing and position. And if you select the frame itself, you have the ability to change rotation if each one of these guys was in its own layer. Right now, because they're both sharing the same layer, I don't have the ability to activate animation. Remember, each symbol or each item that needs to be animated should be in its own layer. So right now, these two things being on the same layer, the computer wouldn't know if I tag that layer to be animated, it wouldn't know which one of the two items I want to animate. So it would probably not let me activate it. And so that wouldn't be a good idea. However, if I make a movie clip, let's say I create a movie clip this time. I'm going to create a shape like this. And I'm going to place it here, and I'm going to make that while having it selected. I'm going to make it a movie clip that basically has its own settings. And if I were to edit this, if I go inside that movie clip, and to go inside that movie clip, I simply double click it. You will notice that I went into it and I didn't give it a name. I left it as symbol 1. This has a timeline of its own. So if I create an animation in here, this animation will be respected even if it's in one frame up here. So if that had animation and I tested this, that animation would play. So keep in mind that embedded animations are respected. So that is how double clicking is how you access the internal portion of that embedded movie clip. So that's a movie clip. Look at the little symbol that indicates it is a movie clip. Click on scene 1 here on the scene 1 label to go back all the way to the top. This one is a button. As we know, we made it a button. So let's double click on that one and see what we get. Like I said before, you have the up state, the over state, the down state, and the hit state. So you can only have access to those 4 different frames to create different options for that particular button. And then let's go back to scene 1. This being a graphic, if I double click it, it has a timeline just like the movie clip. But remember, if the frames on this animation do not match or are not matched by those up on the scene 1, then that animation won't play back the way you expected. So if you are embedding animations inside a graphic and placing them on the stage, you need to make sure that they match, that the main stage, the scene 1 stage, matches the frames of the graphic animation. For movie clips, like I said before, it doesn't matter. Movie clips will play through and through no matter what. They're embedded and they reside in their own timeline. So these are the differences between symbols and comparing them with the objects, just hand-drawn objects that you create in the main stage. Anything that you bring in from other programs will be treated as an object. So if you want to animate things coming from other programs such as Illustrator or Photoshop, they need to be converted either into shapes by breaking them apart or into symbols in order to be animated via motion tween.